debate. The honourable member Lakeland.
Madam Speaker, for 8 years, Conservatives warned the cost of this NDP Liberal government would fuel inflation, hike interest rates, and drive up the cost of living for all Canadians. The Liberals are spending more than ever before, while everyday Canadians are struggling more than ever before. That's the consequence of the costly coalition's tax and reckless spending agenda. Budget 2023's $70 billion in new spending will have to be covered by $4,300 from every Canadian family in the taxes they pay. Since 2019 alone, the Liberals have increased spending $120 billion, and most of it wasn't related to COVID. The Liberal deficit is now over $40 billion a year, and the debt will hit $1.3 trillion only 5 years from now. This Prime Minister has added more debt than every other Prime Minister before combined, and his own Finance Minister confirms that debt interest has increased 80% in the last 3 years. That's $43.9 billion a year, 10% of all government spending. These are shocking numbers that are hard to conceive. But in reality, it means that if you, as a Canadian, paid taxes this year, you paid $1,400 just to service the Liberals' debt, not even to pay it down. So much for the Prime Minister's 2015 promise of 3 years of $10 billion annual deficits. But you know, what they've done is exactly what Conservatives warned. This budget will up the debt, up how much Canadians pay for it, and up the cost of everything in daily life, while Liberals drive away private sector investment, businesses and jobs in key sectors like natural resources that make outsized investments and pay outsized taxes compared to all other sectors for public services and programs that Canadians value. Liberal meddling makes life more expensive for people in Lakeland and across Canada. The January 2023 Liberal tax hikes already cost Canadians over $300 more this year, when half of Canadians were already $200 away from bankruptcy. The Liberal carbon tax will cost Canadians in Lakeland nearly $3,000 a year only 7 years from now, and immediately takes another $700 that they don't have from them this year alone. And while the Liberals may claim otherwise, the independent PBO is clear. Their carbon tax increases the cost of literally everything. That's why Canadians pay more than they will ever get back from these Liberals. 4 in 5 Canadians across all provinces where the Liberals impose their carbon tax will pay more than they get back. That's the truth. While nearly half of Canadians are forced to borrow for basics and have no emergency savings. And more than ever before, 1.5 million Canadians have to go to food banks to make ends meet. And 69% of seniors, they have to work longer than they planned now because NDP Liberals' spending-driven inflation killed the purchasing power of their retirement savings. And what's the Liberals' response? Well, to increase taxes and to increase spending, to wipe out any savings Canadians have been able to keep, and then have the gall to ask struggling Canadians to be grateful when the few who meet complicated criteria get a one-off check for a couple $100 in the mail, which doesn't come close to covering the cost most Canadians face because of these Liberals. They are so out of touch, and Canadians are out of money. The truth is that lower taxes and attractive business conditions always result in more revenue for governments. The Liberals do this backwards. Foreign investment averaged $55.6 billion annually in Canada, while major projects flourished under the former Conservative government. Under these Liberals, a big drop to $39 billion a year. There are big problems with the Liberals' plan for natural resources in Budget 2023. The Liberals shouldn't aim to match the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act's $394 billion in subsidies, which is more than Canada's total annual revenue. But they did try with billions in badly targeted subsidies, while the tax credit incentives won't actually incent and expand energy transformation in Canada as well as they could. Here's why. The U.S. IRA has technology-neutral production tax credits for low-emissions electricity or parts manufacturing, which means established and multi-pronged profitable energy companies can keep investing in these technologies. But in Canada, the Liberals cut out every oil and gas company from eligibility for the Clean Technology Investment Tax Credit, the very companies who currently fund 75% of Canadian clean tech investment in this country overall. The Liberals' tax credit encourages them to put those investments in the U.S. and others where it's welcomed and rewarded. Meanwhile, labor conditions on the Liberals' tax credits, which will infringe on negotiated agreements, are actually likely to harm exclusive solar and wind companies' ability to access the credits, since their workers are often unskilled laborers and the companies just can't meet the Liberals' targets. The Liberals obviously make bad investments with tax dollars, with a third of the budget, $35 billion, that now they're sending to the Canada Growth Fund. Now, Canadians probably remember the very expensive $35 billion Canada Infrastructure Bank that hasn't actually built a single thing after 8 years. It's so bad that Parliament's Industry Committee even says it should be, quote, abolished. Now the Liberals are putting billions into the Canada Growth Fund, run by the board, which, alleged by Hong Kong Watch late last year, invested Canadians' pension funds in companies helping the Communist Party's Uyghur labor camps. So Liberals pick a couple of winners, and they make lots of losers when they put Canadian tax dollars into big government slush funds where they seem to disappear and don't actually benefit Canadians. Conservatives have a better idea. Cut taxes. Scrap the anti-energy, anti-private sector agenda that drives money and businesses away, so Canada can be a world leader in energy and environment technology development and exports without a single taxpayer dime, instead of pumping billions into broken programs and ineffective, poorly targeted tax incentives. Under Conservatives, the private sector built 3 pipelines and reversed a 4th for Western oil to feed Eastern Canadian refineries, and attracted proposals for export pipelines in both directions. In contrast, after 8 years, the Liberals killed 5 pipelines, 5, that would have increased Canadian export capacity, and then even bought TMX because they refused to give the legal and political certainty for the proponent to actually get it built after approval. In the least surprising news ever, and brutal, its cost has ballooned over 350%, from $6.8 billion in the private sector to $30.9 billion today. It should have been in service 4 years ago, and it's not even built. The whole NDP Liberal agenda is designed to hinder Canadian oil and gas, the leading export and private sector investor in the economy. But they're just fine with oil imported from the U.S. and from regimes with lower environmental and human rights standards, while landlocking Canadian resources and innovation, gatekeeping our ability to help lower emissions globally. And instead of attracting foreign investment to Canada, Liberals choose to pay tens of billions of tax dollars to major foreign companies just to get them to do business here. Canada used to have competitive advantages to attract investment, but instead, in a recent announcements, the Liberals are paying $4.3 million tax dollars per job to get a company to expand. That's because they've added layers of new red tape and taxes that drive away the private sector investment and tax revenue that comes from these projects, while they make government less efficient. And maybe the worst part is their anti-energy policies don't even do what they claim. Their actual record on emissions reduction is that after 8 years, every year, emissions increase except for one, 2020, when governments locked Canadians down. And they also promised to plant 2 billion trees, but the Auditor General says they won't even get 4% of that done by the 2030 deadline. And they can't even claim to know their policies work, because the Commissioner also said, quote, Environment and Climate Change Canada did not measure or report on the contributions of each selected greenhouse gas regulation. But the Liberals, they're doubling down with their fuel regulations, a second carbon tax that'll cost Canadians another $1,300 more a year, and up gas 13 cents a litre. Their own research shows it would, quote, increase energy prices and, quote, disproportionately affect lower and middle income households, as we've always warned. They plan more mandates, more standards and regulations to come that will hike costs on everyday Canadians and businesses. And on top of imposing these extra costs that producers in competing countries don't face, their permitting system for natural resource development is broken, second last in the OECD countries, and 64th in the world for building permits. They're talking a big game about getting critical minerals around the world, but it takes 30 years, and they've made no changes. They talk about sending out LNG, but they've allowed 18 proposals under their watch to be abandoned, and they leave Canada behind. It's a travesty. Conservatives would cut taxes, cut red tape, reward people who are hardworking, and unleash Canadian private sector investment and innovation to help lower global emissions and get our economy back on track while protecting taxpayers. Thanks, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, Senate.
Well, thank you, through you, Madam Speaker, to the member for her intervention today. You know, she brought up the carbon tax on a number of occasions, and, you know, at least I'll say one thing. We're consistent on this side. We've ran on it in 2015. We implemented it. We continue to stand by it because we know and we believe that it is a solution to that has been widely recognized throughout the world as a solution to combating the emissions that are out there. But you can't say the same thing about Conservatives, Madam Speaker, because they seem to flip-flop back and forth as to how they feel about a price on pollution. So I'm wondering if this member can comment on what it was like in 2021 when she was going, what it was like. I'm wondering if the member could comment on what it was like in 2021 when she was going around knocking on doors and selling people on the price on pollution that her leader, the member from Durham, was advocating for at the time. Perhaps she didn't agree with it, Madam Speaker, but could she tell us?
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
I and my team did door knock on 10,000 doors in Lakeland over the course of the campaign, and I can just confirm that I actually never sold that plan, and Conservatives have resolved this issue. We will axe the carbon tax. Now, I would actually like to talk about the initiatives that Canada can offer the world to help lower global emissions, the goal that he says he wants to achieve with this carbon tax, but clearly it's shown it's not. Back to this issue around critical minerals. Fewer than half of the mining applications in the last 8 years have actually gone ahead under these guys. Canada has a huge opportunity to actually produce critical minerals and rare earth metals for our own self-sufficient and secure development of the fuels of the future and to export it. But their red tape keeps it in the ground while competitors and hostile regimes dominate globally. That's the exact same thing that's happening with LNG when our allies are begging for Canadian LNG. These guys stand in the way.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
Questions and comments. The member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for Lakeland for her speech. I would like to thank my colleague for Lakeland for her speech. And I'd like to know something, because what I remember from what she said is that the typical Conservative vision, cutting taxes, cutting. I'm just wondering whether the only way to help the public interest is to cut everything or spend everything.
Well, I appreciate the question because it reveals actually just how backwards and what a mess the Liberals have made. Lower taxes and attractive business tools that attract private sector investment always actually result in governments gaining higher tax levels, more taxes, and more revenue that then they can put into the programs and services that Canadians value. The course the Liberals are sending this country on is a betrayal of all future generations. It is an absolute catastrophe for the competitiveness and the economic opportunities of our country. While Canadians are struggling even more than ever before, what this government has to do is actually put needs before wants, establish clear priorities. They don't have a revenue problem. They do have a spending problem, but they need to cut taxes and red tape to make sure the economy can keep firing.